Hello, everybody. Paul Greene-Dennis here, and just make sure. Yep. I'm back. As always, welcome to Paul Greene-Dennis's live readings of information that you should know. Really, it's nonfiction books and history that I feel should be presented, should be out there, but it's not. And not only is it not, hello. Thank you. So, this is us. Yes, history. Okay. All right. So I'm just going to pick up from where I left off of Chapter 8 of One Nation Under Blackmail. And I'm talking about, this is Whitney Webb's One Nation Under Blackmail. And this is Chapter 8, which is the Clinton Contra, picking up where I left off. And this next part is bank building. Bank building. Here we go. Bank building. The last time we encountered Jackson Stevens, he was aiding BCCI's takeover of First General Bank shares, later rechristened as First American Bank shares, and its subsidiary, National Bank of Georgia. He had been brought into the fold through his friendship with one of NBG's big shareholders who had been courted by BCCI, Bert Lance, who Stevens had brought into Arkansas with some of BCCI's representatives for negotiations over their purchases. When Lance began searching for buyers of his NBG stock, BCCI wasn't the only interested party that he brought to Stevens' attention. There was also Mokhtar Riyadi, a politically connected Indonesian banker and financier who commanded the Bank of Central Asia, the third largest private banking firm in Indonesia that held some $100 million in assets. In the years to come, the wealth of Mokhtar and his son, James Riyadi, would swell into the billions, all marshaled up under the auspices of an umbrella corporation called the Lippo Group. Their meteoric ascension was thanks in no small part to the strategic partnership of the Riyadis had with Jackson Stevens and Stevens Incorporated, which developed soon after the Indonesians dropped out of the NBG purchase. How Riyadi first entered the picture is telling. According to various press reports, Riyadi had been introduced to Stevens by Bert Lance, while Lance had first come into contact with Riyadi through an introduction made by Robert B. Anderson, a once well-regarded figure in politics who had become a specialist in offshore banking. Anderson Riyadi, meanwhile, had been brought together several years prior by an unnamed executive from New York City's Chemical Bank. Chemical, at the time, had established a significant presence in Southeast Asia. It had opened branches in Hong Kong, maintained business operations in Singapore, and in Indonesia, it had embarked in a joint venture with the Riyadi family. Chemical Bank would ultimately maintain a long-running alliance with Riyadi interests. In 1988, their joint venture expanded when they teamed up with Royal Bank of Scotland and Jardine Fleming, a Hong Kong partnership between the merchant houses Jardine Matheson and Robert Fleming and Company to set up the Multinational Finance Corp, or Multicorp. According to Mokhtar, Multicorp was first set up and foremost to expand Bank Central Asia's financing channels and financing capabilities. While Riyadi was toying with buying into National Bank of Georgia, commentators and regulators began to suspect that something else was afoot. One common concern was that Riyadi wasn't acting alone, and that he was serving as a front for an Indonesian political interest that hoped to gain political and economic leverage in the United States. Interestingly, in this same period, William Casey had a series of dealings with Indonesian interests. These activities later came back to haunt Casey during his confirmation hearings for the CIA, when he was questioned if he had failed to register as a foreign agent for Indonesia. When he was working in the private sector as an attorney for Rogers and Wells, a time discussed extensively in Chapter 6, Casey took on as clients a complex of interrelated Indonesian interests. There's Pertamina, the country's state-owned oil company, and the Ramayana Indonesia restaurant in New York City. There was also Indonesian Enterprises Incorporated, a holding company that had been set up for the restaurant. Pertamina was the major interest in this holding company, holding all of its Class B stock. Indonesia Enterprises issued Class A stock in turn to various banks and oil companies that were doing business with Pertamina. Holders of Class A stock included Bruce Rappaport's Intermaritime Bank, which was engaged in a convoluted succession of fraudulent tanker chartering deals with Pertamina. Elias Kulukundis, mentioned previously as a close business associate of Edward Carey, was also involved in these chartering activities. Investment capital from Kulukundis and Rappaport further mingled in the tanker companies of a mystery man named Stephen Davis Morrell, whose Tankers International Navigation Corporation joined Pertamina's tanker chartering and in the purchase of Indonesia Enterprises Incorporated stock. Was there any sort of connection between Casey's relationship with Indonesian interests and Anderson's encounter with the Riyadis? The picture is murky, and records of Anderson's own Indonesian activities aren't readily accessible. What is certain, however, is that Anderson was another member, alongside Rappaport, of Casey's Hardy Boys clique, which is certainly suggestive that some sort of collusion was taking place. Furthermore, the list of Indonesian Enterprises Incorporated's Class A stockholders includes Dresser Industries, the Texas oil concern closely intertwined with Bush family interests, where Anderson has sat on the board of directors. It is worth diving a little deeper into Anderson's biography before returning to Stevens and Riyadi, because it is both an illustrated case of high-level political corruption and also intersects in numerous ways with key figures in this ongoing history. With a background in law, Anderson has served in a number of mid-level bureaucratic positions in Texas in the 1930s, including stints as a state's assistant attorney general and as a state tax commissioner. In 1937, he became the general counsel for the W.T. Wagner Estate, headquartered in Vernon, Texas. The Wagner Estate was a large ranching empire that extended its reaches into banking and various other industries, real estate development, and the like. The Wagner family, like many of the great Texas clans, was a source of political clout, and Anderson was soon found mingling with the Texan elite. One impressive early encounter was his purchase of the KTBC radio station, which he then sold to Claudia Alta Lady Bird Johnson, London Johnson's wife, in 1943. He subsequently became a major source of revenue for the Johnson family. Anderson also acted as a lobbyist for powerful Texas oil interests and was particularly close to early industry giants like Sid Richardson, Clint Murchison, and the Bass family. He could also be found at the helm of the Mid-Continent Oil and Gas Association of Texas, which brought together a wide range of businessmen involved in all different aspects of oil production. At the urging of these deep-pocketed petroleum interests, Anderson was brought into the Eisenhower administration. In 1953, he was made Secretary of the Navy, and a year later, he moved and became the Deputy Secretary of Defense. In 1955, he left government and took a position as president of Ventures Limited, a Canadian mining company controlled mostly by American and British industrial and financial interests, before returning to the public sector again as Eisenhower's Secretary of the Treasury. There, he arranged lucrative tax relief packages for Texas Oil. By 1961, he was back in the private sector again, this time managing his own business consultancy, the Anderson Group, located at Rockefeller Plaza. He also joined on as a limited partner at Carlin Loeb, Rhodes & Company, the Wall Street brokerage firm that was closely interlinked with Bronfman interests. Yeesh. The Loeb-Bronfman connection will be discussed in Chapter 11. During this time with Loeb, Rhodes & Company, Anderson developed two important connections. The first was to Bank of America, which was central to the later development of BCCI. In 1964, Anderson joined forces with Bank of America and Belgium's Banque Lambert to set up the World Banking Corporation, an offshore facility in Bermuda that was set up for dealing in the emerging Eurodollars market. That same year, he joined Bank of America's Council of Advisors. He also forged ties with Rockefeller interests. He had been connected to the Rockefellers during his time in the Eisenhower administration, if not earlier, given the presence of the Rockefeller family in Texas. Then, during the 1960s, he became an investment advisor for Standard Oil of Indiana. Jesus Christ. In 1969, this led Anderson, acting on behalf of Standard, to set up an investment consortium in partnership with Maurice Tempelsman, a major player in the international diamond market that would push for American-led interest in the Congo. Tempelsman, interestingly, had ties to American intelligence. With numerous interests across Africa, he recruited veterans of the agency to navigate that world. Oh my God. Oh my God. As Arthur Levi points out, in the 1960s, Tempelsman hired as his business agent the CIA station chief in Kinshasa, Larry Devlin, who helped put Mobutu into power and afterwards served as his personal advisor. What? God damn. There was yet another line leading from Temple's men to Casey's Hardy Boys that was independent of Anderson. According to Alan Block, one of Rappaport's top lieutenants, Jerry Townsend, was a former CIA officer who had worked in Turkey, Zambia, and Burundi with Temple's men. Block adds that Temple's men was part of Rappaport's group, according to Townsend. Then there were the ties between Anderson and the banking circles around BCCI. In the early 1980s, he was found on the board of the Paris-based Saudi European Bank, which was owned by the BCCI-linked Saudi European Investment Corporation (ENVI). Other principals in the Saudi European Bank included John Connolly, the former governor of Texas and George Shultz's predecessor in the Nixon administration as Treasury Secretary. When Connolly was running against Reagan in the early days of the Republican presidential campaign against Carter, Bechtel had initially backed him before switching to support the eventual president. Connolly, at that point, embarked on a voyage as a real estate developer, partnering with the infamously corrupt Ben Barnes, also a former Texan politician, in deals that involved tapping a slew of savings and loans for fraudulent loans. The S&L connection to Saudi European was strong. Its board also counted with the presence of Charles Keating, whose American Continental Corporation and the Lincoln Savings and Loan pumped out bad loans at an astounding rate after the Reagan administration led the deregulation of the S&L industry. Keating and Connolly were close, with the banker having served at first as Connolly's West Coast finance chairman during his political campaign, followed by a shorter stint as campaign manager. Interestingly, one of Connolly's campaign workers, Joyce Downey, later went to work for Connolly and Barnes before relocating to Arizona, where she worked as the office manager for John Singlaub's U.S. Council for World Freedom, the American branch of WACL. USCWF happened to be located next door to the headquarters of Keating's American Continental Corporation. In 1984, Keating's Lincoln Savings invested $18 million into Saudi European's holding company and the Saudi European Investment Corporation. Keating then joined Saudi European's International Advisory Board, while Saudi European began issuing lines of credit to Keating's companies. According to a report in the Los Angeles Times, the bank and its parent company acted as a sham financiers and buyers in Keating's efforts to book profits at Lincoln. A subsidiary of Lincoln called Amcor Investments, which was involved in several complicated real estate arrangements with John Connolly, sold an option it held to Saudi European in order to buy up profits interest in General Oriental Securities Limited, an offshore corporation set up by the corporate raider Sir James Goldsmith for takeover purposes. Goldsmith, as previously mentioned, was part of the Claremont Club and was also one of the main businessmen, along with, wait for it, Robert Maxwell, sought out by Rothschild Incorporated to help the elite banking family expand its influence in the U.S. financial system. In December 1986, Keating, utilizing a subsidiary of his American Continental Corporation called The Given, organized a Bahamian investment corporation called Trendinvest. Joining the board of directors was one of the busiest men in shadow banking, Alfred Hartman, who could also be found alongside Anderson, Keating, and Connolly at the Saudi European Bank. Among the other stakeholders in Trendinvest was Gesellschaft für Trendanalysen, a West German firm that specialized in computerized currency trading, and Royork and Company, a subsidiary of the Royal Bank of Canada. The fuck? Through this offshore vehicle, Keating was able to funnel tens of millions of S&L money out of the United States, money that, in the end, had to be paid back by the U.S. taxpayer. Thus, the fact that Riotti's meeting of Bert Lance, and by extension Jackson Stevens, was made by Anderson reveals the type of networks that enabled the Riotti-Stevens partnership. The story of Jackson Stevens is inseparable from Arkansas's longest-running and most prestigious law firm, Rose Law. Rose's beginnings went back to the 1820s, when Arkansas was still a territory instead of a state. One of its founders was Robert Crittenden, a Kentucky-born lawyer who had been appointed by President James Monroe to act as the governor of the Arkansas territories. His partner was Chester Ashley, one of Arkansas's very first senators. From these beginnings, Rose Law was woven into the fabric of the state itself and remained closely tied to the Arkansas political and economic elite. Arkansas, to quote journalist L.J. Davis, boasted a ruling oligarchy, a small and relatively powerless middle class, and a disenfranchised, leaderless populace. You don't fucking say when you have that type of shit going on. Through the 1970s and into the late 1980s, a period which saw Stevens' star rise in Arkansas, Rose was headed by C. Joseph Girard. In addition to his status as a high-powered attorney, Girard was a specialist in securities. In the 1960s, Girard worked far from Arkansas in the offices of the Securities and Exchange Commission in Washington, D.C. No surprise with his background. While little is known about his activities in the capital, what is certain is that when he returned to his home state, he brought with him an adamantly pro-business outlook and a drive for modernization. Once settled at Rose, he went about upgrading Rose's homespun inclinations from the nascent information age. He bought the firm billable hours, computers, and high-premium securities work, then got in trouble with his side business, buying and selling banks while wearing too many hats for his shallow pockets, and using Rose lawyers to do the work. One particularly controversial banking escapade in which Girard was embroiled involved a string of borrowing from a fraud-riddled savings and loan in Pine Bluff, Arkansas, called First South. Regulators were intrigued by whatever relationship Girard had with the S&L. While he was dipping into their loan basket, he had also become a stakeholder in First South and was writing legal advice to the S&L on paper with a Rose Law letterhead. First South, by the time it collapsed in 1986, had doled out a big pile of loans that were never paid back. Among their biggest borrowers and defaulters was Clint Murchison Jr., the organized crime-linked Texas oil player. There we go again. Organized crime here. A small group of lawyers who worked under Gerard would later become powerful actors in state and federal politics, and while at Rose, they were involved with the firm's strangest dealings. This group was composed of Webster Hubbell, who would become Associate Attorney General under President Clinton, Clinton's future White House counsel Vince Foster, and the soon-to-be First Lady Hillary Rodham Clinton. This trio, like their boss, had an appetite for shady business dealings. All three were partners in a company called Midlife Investors, which had been set up in the early 1980s by E.F. Hutton. Hubbell, Foster, love at first sight, literally. All in the name of fucking over working class. Yeah, billable hours, everything. Hubbell, Foster, and Rodham Clinton each kicked in $15,000 and named each other, rather than their spouses, as beneficiaries. Through midlife, the trio dumped money into companies being targeted by corporate takeover artists like James Goldsmith. Clinton, in particular, liked to haunt the corporate boardrooms and offices, often spending more time working on business affairs than the daily law work demanded by Rose. As L.J. Davis writes, she was only one of two Rose partners to act as corporate director, serving at various times on companies and earning $64,700 in 1991 from director's fees alone. Her 1991 salary from Rose was in the vicinity of $110,000. Her husband earned $35,000 and got to live in a free house. She was on the board of Walmart, a Rose client that Stevens had launched on the road to glory. Rodham Clinton also owned $80,000 worth of Walmart stock. Fuck. She served Southern Development Bancorp, a holding company created to give development loans in rural Arkansas, which, according to the Washington Post, paid Rose somewhere between $100,000 and $200,000 in fees. In 1989, she joined the board of TCBY Yogurt Company, which occupies all the tallest building in Little Rock. TCBY then proceeded to pay Rose $750,000 for legal work during the next few years. Greedy, corrupt fucks. Such was the backdrop of the grand ambitions of Stevens and Riotti for a sprawling business complex. Not satisfied in playing in Arkansas alone, the pair made a very early stopover in Macau, where they bought up massive blocks of stock in the storied Sanghang Bank, which allowed them to gain full control over the company. The sellers had been the trio of Cheng Yutang, Huyen, and Lu Dao. Cheng had been the founder of two interlinked Hong Kong business conglomerates, Sha Tai Fook Businesses and New World Development Company Limited. Through these two large corporations, he had become one of the city's richest individuals. Cheng was very close to Stanley Ho, another Hong Kong billionaire who held the monopoly over Macau's casino industries. In 1989, Stevens and Riotti, curiously enough, sold Sanghong to STDM, a company controlled by Stanley Ho. Ho will appear later again, in Chapter 16, as one of his close business partners in Lapsang, was a key figure in the so-called Chinagate scandal of the mid-1990s. I am so looking forward to reading that fucking corruption. Chang's associate in Shanghai, Ho Yin, is worth examining briefly. Like Chang and Stanley Ho, Ho Yin was another Hong Kong-based businessman with numerous Macau holdings. What he was most infamous for, however, was his role in Macau's illicit gold trade, which flourished due to international regulations governing gold markets from the end of World War II through the early 1970s. His particular largest derived from the ties he had cultivated with the nascent Chinese Communist Party, having made contacts with Mao and Zhou Enlai shortly after the revolution. His work managing funds for the party earned him a spot among the so-called red fat cats, and he even held a position on the standing committee of the Chinese National People's Congress. In Macau, meanwhile, he ran multiple public companies and for a time served as vice president for the Macau Legislative Assembly. He also ran numerous businesses, including multiple banks through which his gold trade flowed. Among these banks was Shanghai. Until 1974, when gold trading was deregulated, $40 to $50 million worth of gold passed through the narrow door of Shanghai annually. All in all, this made a very interesting purchase on the part of Stevens and Riotti. Shanghai wasn't the only bank the duo bought in 1983. That was also the year they began purchasing the stake held by Midland, Texas oilman John Hendricks in the First Arkansas Bank Stock Corporation, Fabco. As part of the deal, Fabco issued additional stock that could be purchased exclusively by Stevens and Riotti. Combined with Hendricks's holding, Stevens Incorporated and Lippo achieved control over Fabco as a joint venture. This takeover granted them control over a wide network of Arkansas banks that were held by Fabco. Good grief, these greedy bastards. These included Worthen Bank and Trust Co. of Little Rock, First National Bank of Hot Springs, the National Credit Corps of Pine Bluff, and the First National Bank of Mena. That the latter bank was located in the same town where the CIA had set up shop and where drug smuggling was taking place raises all sorts of questions. However, at the same time, the acquisition of these banks was a part of a wider effort by Stevens and Riotti to build out an Arkansas banking empire. They turned to Joseph Girard, the head of the Rose Law Firm, to lobby for changes in state laws that restricted the range of the activities that bank holding companies would carry out. Could carry out. Girard then purchased several banks, which were subsequently sold to Stevens and Riotti. For his efforts, Girard received money, a large block of Worthen stock, and a spot on Worthen's board. Rose Law became counsel to Worthen, and the bank itself was transformed into something of a flagship for Stevens' interests. And that was the development of all those banks. And that was the bank building portion. Now we get to the next portion, Clinton's development machine in this chapter. Here we go. In late 1984, Governor Bill Clinton unveiled an ambitious economic development plan for the state of Arkansas. It was a sterling example of Clinton's commitment to a pro-business vision of government and the direct foreshadowing of the sorts of economic policies that would become the norm during his time as U.S. president. As one Arkansas newspaper put it, Clinton's agenda would wed some state agencies, their activities, funds, and fund sources to efforts of the private sector. It included the creation of a science and technology hub to seed the birth of new firms, industries, and innovations in Arkansas, and a capital fund that would aggressively lend higher risk capital to member banks. The centerpiece of Clinton's plan, however, was the transformation of Arkansas Housing Development Authority, established in the 1970s, into the Arkansas Development Finance Authority, ADFA. The transition was more than a cosmetic change. The mandate for the new agency was to do in the field of business development what it does in the field of housing development. What? A month later, in January, Clinton outlined how the ADFA would work. It would sell a wide range of tax-exempt revenue bonds to generate revenue. The money would then be passed to financial institutions for low-interest economic development loans. The fortunes of Jackson Stevens became intimately entangled with the activities of the ADFA. Stevens Incorporated, for example, was frequently utilized by the ADFA to underwrite the bonds it issued. Stevens's Worthing Bank, meanwhile, sometimes acted as the trustee for loans made by the ADFA. The bank itself as a trustee for loans, the bank itself directly interlocked with the agency itself. The president of the Worthing branch in the city of Pine Bluff, Arkansas, James Stobaugh, sat on the ADFA board. To make matters even more incestuous, one of the recipients of a major ADFA loan, Arkansas Freightways, was a freighter company in which Stevens Incorporated held the controlling stake. Rose Law, of course, was Arkansas Freightways' legal representative of choice. The ADFA seems to have had a particularly close relationship with Beverly Enterprises, a subsidiary of Stevens Incorporated that managed a national nursing home chain. Bobby Stevens, no familiar relation to Jackson Stevens, the vice president of Beverly Enterprises, sat alongside Stobaugh on the board of the ADFA. Unsurprisingly, Beverly Enterprises profited handsomely from ADFA bond insurance and retained the services of Rose Law. Several Rose Law associates, including Webster Hubbell, owned stock in Beverly. Beverly would later pop up in the Inslaw affair, discussed in the next chapter, due to allegations that it was using the infamous compromised version of the Promise software. Holy shit. Besides Stephen Inc., the ADFA was a great economic boon for Clinton's friend Dan Lassiter and his bond business, Lassiter and Company. Larry Nichols, the ADFA's marketing director, who had been dismissed by the governor, charged that the agency had been set up by Clinton for Dan Lassiter. The reason for Nichols' dismissal is intriguing. The press had learned that he had been using ADFA phones to make long-distance calls to Contra leaders, which he insisted had been authorized by ADFA head Wooten Apes. While there might have been a bit of hyperbole and vindictiveness in Nichols' allegation, it is true that Lassiter and Company acted as an underwriter for bonds issued by the agency. Holy crap. There seems to have been a high degree of competition between Stevens Incorporated and Lassiter and Company when it came to these underwriting contracts, but there was at least one direct link between the two companies. Michael Drake, formerly of Stevens Incorporated, was the vice president of Lassiter and Company. The ADFA's first industrial development loan was granted to a strange company in Russellville, Arkansas, called Park on Meter Incorporated, or POM for short. It was another clear-cut example of Arkansas's nepotism. The law firm that handled the legal work on the loan was Rose Law, while POM's founder and president was Seth Ward II, the brother-in-law of Webster Hubbell. Alexander Cockburn, who penned a series of articles on POM, noted that Worthing Bank appeared among the institutions that from time to time had liens on POM. In Compromised, Terry Reed and John Cummings wrote that the initial ADFA loan to POM was intended for the expansion of their industrial capacities in connection with a subcontract the company had gained from Ivor Johnson's Arms, a New Jersey-based firearms manufacturer. In addition to parking meters, POM was dipping into the armament business. On behalf of Ivor Johnson's, Reed and Cummings claimed POM was constructing bolts and carrier assemblies for M16 rifles. Ivor Johnson's, in turn, had been tapped by the CIA for covert weapons production, and the M16s were ultimately destined for the Contras in Nicaragua. Howard Schneider, a journalist for the Washington Post, found that the Ivor Johnson's company near Little Rock, which the book Compromised portrays as being the center of the gun manufacturing effort, did ship a load of weapons to Nicaragua through a Mexican distributor, precisely the arrangement that Reed and Cummings described. POM itself was found to have had a contract to make gun parts on behalf of Ivor Johnson's, through Seth Ward Jr., though Seth Ward Jr. told the Post that it had been firing pins, not bolts. Ivor Johnson's, for its part, identified the arms as M1 rifles, not M16s. Gary Webb observed a stark similarity between the gun manufacturing operation in Texas and a similar operation that had taken shape on the Cabazon Indian Reservation in Riverside County, California. What had started off as a takeover of the tribe as part of a plan to develop a gambling hub by John Philip Nichols, a mobster with reputed CIA ties. Here you go again. Organized crime and intelligence, had transformed into an intricate joint venture with the Wackenhut Corporation and a handful of other firms, at least one of which was a direct CIA cutout company, to develop weapons systems. Some of these, such as a line of lightweight machine gun pistols, were intended to be provided to the Contras. These activities at Cabazon were at the center of journalist Danny Carsolaro's investigation into the network that he dubbed the Octopus, and Cabazon played a key role in the Insular Affair or Promise Scandal, the subject of the next chapter. Contra leader Eden Pastora, who later ran afoul with the Enterprise and was the target of an assassination attempt in May 1984, attended at least one weapons demonstration at Cabazon. The list of those present for this demonstration included John Vanderwerker, a CIA research and development specialist, G. Wayne Reeder, a crooked developer close to Nichols. Reeder, incidentally, was a major SNL borrower with close connections to Herman Beebe, and Earl Bryan, a close friend of Ronald Reagan and the controlling interest behind several tech firms. Bryan, who was purported to have arrived at the demonstration with Reeder, would emerge as a central player in the Inslaw affair. Michael Riconosciuto, a chief witness in that case, was also at the demonstration and was subsequently charged that the alterations made to Inslaw's promised software were made at Cabazon. Riconosciuto further attested to personal knowledge of Contra-oriented weapons development taking place at POM in Arkansas. He told Alexander Cockburn that POM had entered into an arrangement with Wackenhut and Stormont Labs, a California-based genetics research and pharmaceutical company, to develop chemical and biological weapons that could be deployed in chemical guerrilla warfare. An Army chemical unit was purported to have supplied POM with chemical agents, while the parking meter manufacturer, as part of its end of the agreement, prototyped explosive devices such as grenades and bombs that would disperse the chemicals. The fuck? Internal documentation from Cabazon Arms, the joint venture between Wackenhut and the Cabazon tribe, does allude to Stormont Labs in the context of agents and production techniques related to biological war. The document in question, obtained by Casolaro and today logged in an archived collection of his surviving papers, was a letter from Nichols to a Harry Fair at Tactical Technology in Arlington, Virginia. That would be the Tactical Technology Office of the Pentagon's DARPA, which Fair was connected to in the mid-1980s. Mentioned elsewhere in the papers of the Cabazon-Wackenhut joint venture was a company called First Intercontinental Development Corporation, FIDCO, described by author Sherry Seymour as a purported National Security Council front company. Directors of FIDCO included Michael McManus, an attorney who served as an assistant to Reagan's chief of staff, George K. Pender, and Kenneth Rowe of Burns and Poe, and Clinton Murchison Jr. That guy is everywhere. As mentioned earlier, Murchison Jr. himself was in and out of Arkansas, borrowing heavily from the Rose Law-linked First South Savings and Loan. When questioned about Riconosciuto's claims, Ward Jr. told a journalist from The Nation that POM wasn't in the chemical warfare business. The company was instead busy making re-entry cones for the nuclear warheads on MX missiles and nozzles for rocket engines. Intriguingly, the U.S. Army's 354 Chemical Company, since April 1981, had been located in Russellville, Arkansas. This unit maintained property directly adjacent to POM's industrial complex. Riconosciuto told Alexander Cockburn and Bryce Hoffman, a journalist for The Nation, that since 1981, POM had been in the business of making drop tanks, auxiliary fuel tanks attached to the exteriors of aircraft, for C-130s. However, Cockburn and Hoffman were not able to confirm via the FAA which regulates tank manufacturing. That POM was an authorized producer. Cockburn writes that when Hoffman contacted the FAA, the official with whom he spoke apparently misunderstood his question on drop tank regulations and assumed he was a prospective manufacturer. Oh, so you must have one of those Southern Air transport contracts. All this corruption. Next part of this chapter, offshored. One of the weirder intersections in the ADFA complex was between the development agency and the Coral Reinsurance Company, which had been set up in the offshore haven of Barbados. Reinsurance is basically insurance for insurance companies. It allows Company A, in this case, the primary insurance firm, to offload portions of its risk onto Company B, the reinsurance company. The reasons for this are multifold. It offers a buffer or protection for the insurance company from risks, while also, and perhaps more importantly, allowing insurance companies to engage in expanded business practices that might otherwise have been blocked by government regulations requiring particular asset to risk ratios. Often, insurance companies will set up their own reinsurance companies for this exact purpose. In order to hide the ownership structures, offshore havens are selected to create these companies. This is exactly how Coral functioned. It took debt and other risks off the books of its parent, though this parent was hidden through proxies. Proxies everywhere. On the other side of this firewall, in actual control of Coral, was American International Group, AIG, the international insurance and financial monolith that, during the 2008 financial crisis, was bailed out by the U.S. government to the tune of $180 billion. In the Financial Crisis Inquiry Report published in 2011, AIG was identified as having a lengthy history of engaging in overly risky ventures, frequently carried out with little to no hedging or protection. AIG's creation of Coral is just one example of this. And this is why this is all bipartisan. Because who bailed out those banks? Obama. In order to hide its connection to Coral, AIG had called upon the resources of Goldman Sachs, oh Lord, which in turn did the actual legwork in setting up the reinsurance company. Overseeing this operation was the head of Goldman's Stock and Bond Trading Department, Robert Rubin. Rubin would subsequently serve as co-chairman of Goldman, starting in 1990, before transitioning to a storied career in public service. At the beginning of 1993, Bill Clinton, now president, appointed him as the director of his National Economic Council. A year later, Rubin was sworn in as Clinton's Treasury Secretary. He served in that position until 1999, and upon leaving the government, went to work at Citigroup. As will be noted in chapter, scumbag Rubin, that scumbag. As will be noted in chapter 16, Rubin was the person who signed off on Jeffrey Epstein's first visit to the Clinton White House in early 1993. Goldman Sachs organized Coral in such a way that AIG would not appear as a stockholder. Instead, stocks would be spread around to a small select group who had been handpicked by Goldman. One of these was Samuel Zell, a shady property flipper from Chicago who had ties to the Golettas family, whose significant ties to Epstein are detailed in Chapter 12. Holy fuck. As well as to Burton Cantor. In 1976, Zell and Cantor, along with a handful of other associates, were indicted for hiding money gained from real estate deals in Helliwell and Cantor's Castle Bank. The ADFA, however, was the largest holder of stock in Coral Reinsurance. It fueled its purchase in Goldman's private offering with a hefty multi-million-dollar loan from the Chicago branch of Japan's Sanwa Bank, which had a history of money laundering allegations. What bank at this point hasn't had a history of that? Money laundering. For instance, Sanwa's Los Angeles branch had been a depository for money pilfered by the Marcos family of the Philippines. Interestingly, Terry Reid and John Cummings write and compromised that the ADFA loan to Park Armida was purchased by Fuji Bank of Japan. Fuji Bank has a history of involvement with Sanwa Bank, and the two banks have undertaken several different merger projects since the 1970s. What brought the ADFA to the attention of Goldman Sachs and AIG? It is strange that a fairly obscure state government development agency, albeit one teeming with ties to intelligence networks and criminal enterprises, would be selected by these major Wall Street businesses to effectively underwrite AIG's reassurance apparatus. The answer is that the deal was arranged through the ADFA's powerful insider, Jackson Stevens. It turns out that Stevens boasted all sorts of business connections with AIG. For example, an offshore company called Beverly Indemnity was doing some work underwriting policies issued by AIG. Beverly Indemnity was itself something of a hidden subsidiary of Beverly Enterprises and was run by Beverly's general counsel, Robert Palmerville. The nursing homes managed by Beverly Enterprises were insured by National Union Fire and Home Insurance of Pittsburgh, an insurance company 100% owned by AIG. National Union Fire and Home had its own connections into the world of offshore insurance hijinks. According to financial journalist Lucy Comazar, the AIG subsidiary was providing insurance to Victor Parsons MVF Corp. Via an offshore company called Chesapeake Insurance. Parsons MVF, as mentioned in Chapter 6, had been one of the firms represented by William Casey in the years just prior to his time as Reagan's CIA director. Importantly, Reagan offered the position of deputy director to the CIA to Maurice Greenberg, then the head of AIG. Greenberg, who had maintained long-standing ties to the agency, declined the offer. Greenberg's ties to the CIA are nestled within a wider history of involvement of AIG with the world of intelligence. Good grief. Hold on. Just want to double check something. Okay. These ties stretched back to the earlier years of the company, when it was known as American International Underwriters and was overseen by the company's founder, Cornelius Vanderstar. Starr had set up a string of insurance companies across the Asia and the Pacific region, which became key nodes in the wartime intelligence apparatus. Starr himself went to work for the OSS, which brought him into contact with other China hands like Paul Helliwell. These insurance companies were deployed as cover for OSS agents, many of whom had started off as Starr's employees. In addition, AIG's longtime general counsel, Duncan Lee, had served in the OSS as the special assistant to William Donovan. After the war, he went to work as counsel for the CIA's Civil Air Transport. Incredibly, Lee was eventually outed as having acted as a mole for Soviet intelligence within the OSS. The connection between Starr and Helliwell was of particular importance. In 1963, Helliwell and Inge Gordon Moswald, a frontman for Daniel K. Ludwig, the mysterious billionaire shipping magnate, set up the Bank of the Caribbean Limited. It was something of a paper bank, established and then left on the shelf. During the mid-1960s, it was picked up by American International Underwriters and rechristened as Underwriters Bank Limited. The directors of the bank were all individuals connected to Helliwell and Cantor's Castle Bank, signaling that the insurance complex that would become AIG was woven into the same hot money networks utilized by the CIA and organized crime. That Sam Zell, with his own dealings with Cantor and Castle Bank, would end up alongside the ADFA as a stockholder in AIG's Coral Reinsurance suggests that these networks are in fact linked directly together. Also instructive is the fact that Paul Helliwell himself seems to have been involved in the very first offshore reinsurance companies, which he set up on behalf of George Eccles, who sat on the board of the Moody-controlled American National Insurance Company, or ANICO. AIG, meanwhile, took credit itself for developing the practice of offshore reinsurance companies. Given the intertwined history of Helliwell and AIG, it is possible that both stand together at the genesis of these deceptive financial tactics. Good grief. And now, here we are to finish up this chapter, which is the BCCI returns. Jackson Stevens liked to spread around his money and political influence. He was not content trafficking just with the Clintons and Arkansas interest, even if they were being propelled at a rapid pace toward the White House. He was also intent on cozying up to their counterparts in the Republican Party, the Bush family. See, this is all one big party, and you ain't in it. It don't matter who. In the late 1980s, Stevens was a member of the Bush-led Team 100 project, which was a coterie of deep-pocketed GOP donors who had contributed at least $100,000 to the party. A Washington Post article on the Team 100 noted that donors included Major Drexel Burnham Lambert clients Frank Lorenzo, Ronald Perelman, T. Boone Pickens, and Saul Steinberg. During this same time period, Stevens' wife, Mary Ann, served as the co-chair of the Bush for President campaign's Arkansas wing. Few cases, however, are as telling as the encounter between Jackson Stevens and Harkin Energy, a small oil company oddly full of influential principals, the best known among them being George W. Bush, who was both a stakeholder and director. The fuck? The level of fucking corruption here. The story of Stevens and Harkins brings, among other things, BCCI back into the picture, and also sets the stage for the deepening relationship between BCCI individuals and the banking networks down in Arkansas. Harkin was created in July 1973. The company was incorporated in California by two Wall Street traders, Phil Kendrick Jr. and Henry L. Mulligan. Their early target was Australia, which was viewed at the time as a place with untapped drilling potential. They soon entered into a consortium alongside Esso and Exxon, and before long, Harkin had a dozen wells producing a modest amount of crude. In 1983, Kendrick and Mulligan unloaded Harkin into a syndicate led by a pair of New York attorneys, Allen and Wayne Quasha. A sizable share of Harkin's stock was purchased by an offshore company called North American Resources, or NAR. NAR was a joint venture of the Quashas and the Richemont Group. Richemont is based in Switzerland, but first began in South Africa under the leadership of its founder, Anthony Rupert. Richemont had been formed on the basis of Rupert's predecessor company, set up in 1947, called the Rembrandt Group. Rembrandt had been closely tied to European financial interests. For example, Edmund L. Rothschild, then chairman of N.M. Rothschild, had served on the board of Rembrandt. Even the initial fortune that Rupert used to set up Rembrandt can ultimately be traced back to European origins. In 1943, he had become the head of the South African subsidiary of the Distillers Company, the Scottish alcohol and pharmaceutical giant that, as noted in Chapter 2, was intimately connected to the Brahmins. The Quashas, meanwhile, are perhaps even more interesting than their South African business partner. Allen and Wayne Quasha worked at the law firm founded by their father, William Quasha, who, throughout the 1970s and 1980s, operated from his base in the Philippines. Jonathan Whitney, in his classic work, Crimes of the Patriots, linked Quasha directly to Nugan, the Australian bank that was utilized by Ted Shackley, Edwin Wilson, and others in their network. General Leroy Manor, a counterinsurgency specialist, had become the chief of staff for the U.S. Military Pacific Command before retiring and taking a position running the Nugan office in the Philippines. He tapped Quasha to serve as the office's attorney. Nugan Philippines office was closely tied to the country's corrupt leader, Ferdinand Marcos. General Manor had known Marcos since his days in the U.S. Pacific Command, even when the two negotiated over the land rights for American military bases in the Philippines. Whitney adds that Marcos's brother-in-law, Ludwig Rocca, actually shared the Nugan office suite, and Rocca's International Development and Planning Corporation took over the suite after Nugan's collapse. Rocca himself moved money through the bank, while Ferdinand Marcos and his wife Imelda were rumored to do the same. Quasha himself appears to have had ties to the Marcos family. When Marcos was facing stiff political opposition in 1986, he penned a controversial statement in support of the leader. It was subsequently revealed that the Marcos family hid away massive amounts of money and gold pilfered from the Filipino citizenry, the public coffers, and the country's gold mines in secret Swiss bank accounts, namely those at the Union Bank of Switzerland. According to Whitney, Union Bank of Switzerland also appeared in the course of the Nugan Hand affair. Bernie Houghton, one of the bank's founders, was well acquainted with a traveling official of the Union Bank and had brought him around to Nugan Hand representatives in Asia to make introductions. David Armstrong, who penned an expose of Harkin in Z magazine in 1991, noted that Union Bank of Switzerland maintained connections to other figures involved in the oil company. Harkin was closely connected to a Denver, Colorado-based company called Frontier Oil and Refining Company, where Alan Quasha served as chairman of the board, which was taken over in the late 1980s by the Richemont Group's Anthony Rupert. Armstrong writes that when Rupert acquired Frontier in a leveraged buyout in 1988, he announced a $85 million revolving credit facility with Union Bank of Switzerland, replacing all the refiner's previous working capital facilities. Union Bank of Switzerland also had a history with one of Harkin's more surprising investors. What the fuck? The billionaire hedge fund manager George Soros. Shortly after the Quasha-Rupert takeover of Harkin in 1983, Soros became the next biggest shareholder in the company after them. In 1984, an arrangement was made when Harkin would act as the exclusive agent and manager of Soros Oil Incorporated. 2 years later, Harkin would gain 2 additional and equally surprising shareholders. For one, there was the Harvard Management Company, the body set up under the auspices of the Harvard Corporation to manage the elite university's investments. The fuck? Less than a decade later, Harvard and Soros would be found alongside each other again in arranging the privatization and looting of Russia's state-owned industries shortly after the collapse of the Soviet Union. Fucking scumbags. As Russ Baker has shown, the longtime head of the Harvard Corporation, Robert G. Stone, was intimately familiar with the elite circles where business and intelligence mixed. Intriguingly, the president of the Harvard Management Corporation, Michael Eisenson, stated that there were not too many degrees of separation between the Stone and the Quashas. There was also not too many degrees of separation between Stone and the Quash's partner, Anthony Rupert. Stone's father-in-law was Godfrey A. Rockefeller, a cousin of the better-known David, Nelson, and Lawrence brothers, and a college friend of George H.W. Bush. In the late 1960s and early 1970s, Godfrey played a central role in organizing the World Wildlife Fund. Interesting fact, I think this is the same World Wildlife Fund that I think was suing the WWE when they were the World Wrestling Federation and told them either we're going to continue to sue or you got to switch your name. And that's how they became WWE, if I'm not mistaken. According to a memorial published by the fund after his death in 2010, He had even hired their first staff and chief scientist. This would have certainly brought Godfrey into direct contact with Rupert, as the Southern African businessman had been personally recruited into the organization by Prince Bernard of the Netherlands in 1968. Also joining Harkin in 1986 alongside Harvard was the son of Godfrey's friend, George W. Bush. It was also the year that Harkin brought up Spectrum 7, a beleaguered oil company that had been formed from a merger between Bush Exploration, set up originally as Arbusto Energy by George W. Bush in 1977, with investment capital provided in part by CIA asset Jim Bath, as well as the oil concerns of Ohio businessmen William DeWitt Jr. and Mercer Reynolds III. Spectrum was reportedly barely even an oil producer, less concerned with recovering oil than in creating tax shelters. The company specialized in selling limited partnerships, which generated generous write-offs before the tax laws were revised in 1986. Russ Baker writes that within several years of the deal between Bush Energy and Spectrum, DeWitt and Reynolds were on the ground floor of an insurance and reinsurance company called Midwest Employers Casualty Company, MECC. Stevens Inc., which, as noted above, was actively connected to the world of reinsurance, was one of the big stockholders in MECC. When Spectrum was purchased by Harkin, When Spectrum was purchased by Harkin, Bush, formerly Spectrum's CEO, joined Harkin's board of directors. He also received a sizable chunk of Harkin's stock and a high-dollar consultancy fee that he continued to receive after he went to work on his father's presidential campaign in the late 1980s. In December 1988, Bush took out a low-interest loan from Harkin, which he used to purchase more of the company's stock. As the 1980s drew to a close, Harkin had drawn itself even deeper into the orbit of Bush-connected interest. It organized a commodity trading subsidiary, which formed a close working relationship with Enron. Enron's president, Kenneth Lay, had been a big supporter of George H.W. Bush since the 1980 election, and the company would later become one of George W. Bush's greatest political benefactors. However, it was in 1987, before Bush re-upped his Harkin stock, that the company crossed paths with Clinton's and Bush's backer, Jackson Stevens. After the Spectrum 7 buyout, Harkin had a debt problem. Kenny boy, yeah. After the Spectrum 7 buyout, Harkin had a debt problem and was in need of further financing in order to resolve his core issues. They turned to Stevens Inc., which quickly went to work and brought in the Union Bank of Switzerland. Union Bank brought up Harkin stock via Stevens, but soon the bank ran into a regulatory snag. The stock was then moved to another client of Stevens Inc., Sheikh Abdullah Tahabah, who was a close associate of two BCCI insiders, Khalid bin Mahfouz and Gaith Farhan. Union Bank of Switzerland, for its part, had its own BCCI ties. Together with the criminal bank, it owned a Swiss bank called Banque de Commerce et de Placements, BCP. Representing BCCI interest at BCP was the ubiquitous Alfred Hartman. Despite these efforts, by 1989, Harkin was in trouble yet again. The commodity trading subsidiary proved disastrous, costing Harkin some $17 million in losses by the end of that year. Soros exited at the same time, and along the way managed to convince Harkin to sell their stake in the lucrative Crystal Oil Company of Louisiana to his quantum fund Envy. Harkin's future was now uncertain, as the company faced a cash shortage. Yet, suddenly, in January 1990, it landed an inexplicable oil deal with the mineral-rich country of Bahrain. David Armstrong wrote that the deal gave Harkin the exclusive exploration, development, production, transportation, and marketing rights to most of Bahrain's offshore oil and gas reserves. The territories covered in the pact lie sandwiched between the world's largest oil field, off the shore of Saudi Arabia, and one of the biggest natural gas fields off the shore of Qatar. The cast behind Harkin's landing of this deal, which came at such a crucial time for the company, was full of the usual suspects. There was David Edwards, who acted as a go-between for Harkin and Bahrain. He had previously worked for Siemens Incorporated and had been involved in the Harkin Union Bank of Switzerland negotiations. There was Bahrain's Prime Minister, Sheikh Khalifa bin Salman Al Khalifa, whose brother was a BCCI stockholder in 1990. And there was the U.S. ambassador to Bahrain, Charles Hostler. He was reportedly close to BCCI frontman Mohammed Mahmoud, who, as discussed previously, was tied up in various business and political ventures with Senator Orrin Hatch and Adnan Khashoggi. And what about Abdullah Taha Bach, the man who ended up with Union Bank of Switzerland's Harkin shares? In October 1990, the New York Times reported that he had acquired a 9.6% stake in the Worthen Banking Corporation, a bank holding company based in Little Rock, Arkansas. And that, ladies and gentlemen, however you identify, is the end of Chapter 8, Clinton Contra, in One Nation Under Blackmail, by Volume 1 by Whitney Webb. And I will resume reading Chapter 9 next week on Monday, which is High-Tech Treason. And that chapter will go into starting off with the making of a Maxwell, none other than Robert Maxwell. With that, have a good night and continue to stay informed. I do this reading to deprogram myself and learn the real history of this fucking country, as everyone else should, I think. With that, have a good night. See you on next Monday with Chapter 9, High-Tech Treason of One Nation Under Blackmail, Volume 1 by Whitney Webb. Have a good night.